So the last slider, the mystery slider we haven't talked about, is the contrast slider and why we don't use it. We don't use it because it's a very, very coarse control. Let me go back and open another image and and just give you an idea. So here's an image. You remember this one from before. It's a pretty messed up image. Well, let's recover some of those highlights first. There we go. And it's not quite so messed up here. But the image is very, very flat, and you could use the contrast slider to add a little contrast. But the problem is you don't have much control over what you get. It's just kind of, well, it's like the contrast slider in regular Photoshop. So instead what we use is a contrast curve. It's the next tab over. It's the tone curve. There's actually two tone curves here. One's parametric and one's point. I prefer the point one, but I'll show you how the parametric works, and you can use whichever one is comfortable to you. This curve is different than the ones in Photoshop, because the ones in Photoshop we use for a lot of for color correction and things like that. This is really mostly for adding contrast. And basically you have 4 different sliders you can adjust here. If you drag the highlight slider to the right, and you'll notice all of them are brighter on the right and darker on the left. So you can just tell dragging this is going to brighten up your highlights. Now, it is bending the curve, but really you can almost just look at your image. It's almost like, picture kind of levels, right? Because these are sliders, right? Just a fancier levels. So drag this to the right and you can see the highlights have gone up. Drag the shadows down and you can see the shadows go down. And the steeper this curve becomes, of course, the more contrast your image will have. So you can drag down and make it really steep, make it steeper still, and you're really, really getting some contrast by just basically keeping your curve, very, very steep. And if, for instance, if you go and drag your shadows, quite about as far as they will go, and you want to go a little further, you're like, wow, just not getting enough punch, you can move how far the curve affects into the midtones and other areas. So everything from here down is now going to be shadows. And same thing with the highlights. You can decide where, what part of the curve is going to affect the highlights. So that's basically it. Now, I'm not particularly as happy about this as I am with the point curve, but let's go ahead and reset this. Remember, double click, resets it, double click, and double. And you can see it was pretty flat. All right, there's the original. Let's hit the point curve. Now, the point curve, what I like about it is it has some built-in starting points already. So there's medium contrast, which builds, just a decent amount of contrast, and this is kind of the default setting. And then there's strong contrast. However, since it already has points on the curve, if you decide that you want to make it more contrasty, it's very easy just to click on a point, which you can see that it was hollow and now it's solid right there, and just use the up arrow key on your keyboard to create, more highlights in the highlight areas. Click here and go downward to create a steeper curve. And look how how steep that curve is getting. There you go. It's taking just a second to catch up there. And you can really create just a lot of kind. And of course, you can just pick it up and move it, but it's easier to just use to be more precise using the arrow keys. And if you hold the shift key, it moves in like 10-point increments instead of single-point increments. So that's another way. Again, there is no right or wrong answer here, whichever one you're more comfortable using. I like the point curve because it gives me a good place to start first, and it generally keeps you out of more trouble than you'll get into with the parametric one, because you can do some really screwy curves with this thing. Okay, so that's why we don't really use contrast, because you really have a lot more control. This basically, it's either on or off, but with the point curve, you've got a lot of choices of how you basically add contrast to your image. So the next time you think this image looks a little flat, you know what to do. Hey, by the way, now that we've made this change, you might want to lower the exposure just a little bit. There we go. Because when you add contrast, it does affect how the whole image looks. So it's going to make the image a little more poppy and a little brighter in area. Well, just think about this for contrast. It makes the brightest areas brighter and the darkest areas darker. All right. So let's put some of this to use.